Learn how to think like an intelligence agent, not in terms of political ideology. That is very, very important. Please subscribe to this channel if you don't want to miss any more videos. So, what is the secret of success for the Anglo-American Empire? You know, the British colonial empire and then the United States and the merger of those two. What made them so successful? There's basically three components: science, very strong family ties and dynasties, and a very high degree of competence in the intelligence business. Now, of course, all of these three factors, they overlap. So, for example, the scientific breakthrough happened right around the year 1700. And the British colonial empire, they tried to control it as much as possible through the Royal Society, the predominant scientific organization in the world. And they, of course, were very much engaged also in intelligence matters. So they always wanted to, find new stuff and hide their own ideas to make the British colonial empire more competitive. Then, of course, these cluster of dynasties, not just the classic aristocratic dynasties, which were huge, but also the American upper class. These are very, very, very large clusters of families, and they usually like each other, and they are usually involved in intelligence operations. So even before the modern type intelligence agencies, which were official and had an official building, an official name, official budget, even before that, you had vast intelligence networks, but they were sort of a hybrid between private and government. Because these families, they had all the best roles in government and industry. They had the money and they had everything else that they needed. And so it is about time that average people started to learn how to think like an intelligence asset and not in terms of standard political ideologies. So you should learn from the winners, not from the losers. Political ideologies have always been a facade and a tool for regular empires. So no matter if it's this enlightened democracy or socialism or various right-wing constructs of governments, it's always imperialism, right? And so in our Western democracies, citizens have a certain choice within a certain frame. So we can pick that party over the other party, you can pick that ideology over the other ideology, and you can complain about everybody else's ideology. But all these standard categories are very, very strongly controlled. And of course, these different ideologies, the followers hate each other. And it's a very, very limited thinking, and oftentimes removed from reality. Now, every ideology has important aspects, right? So the conservatives have a very strong focus on traditional families and structures that have grown over a certain amount of time. The socialists understand fairly well how crazy the inequality of wealth is and how much people are getting scammed. So it's not like anybody can just work their way up and get their chances. So it's a very scammy sort of capitalism that you find. And let's face it, one of the best recruitment tools for socialism are these disgusting corporations that treat everybody like dirt. And so on and so forth. Now, of course, the libertarians, they have a very strong focus on individual liberty, which is very important. And it's also, they also know how important it is to have the freedom to trade and to own, and that it's not a win-lose kind of system. So it's a win-win system. This is something the socialists do not understand. So classical Marxism postulates there's always got to be losers. And so it's always kind of a bad deal, and it has to break down and it has to destroy the world, which is truly not the case. I mean, you have psychopaths and malignant narcissists everywhere, and so if you got that problem, and these psychos, they have all this intelligence training, that's the real problem, right? So you can't just solve that basic underlying problem just by picking one of these standard ideologies. So, ideological thinking has, let's say, 3 core flaws. The biggest flaws that they have. And the first one is this. So sympathy and trust are when you talk about ideologies and ideological circles, sympathy and trust is based on ideological factors. So if somebody else has the same or professes to have the same ideology as you, there goes sympathy, and you're more likely to trust that person. And that shouldn't be the criteria. So how close people are in terms of ideology, you should rather have real criteria. So you get Western socialists, and they trust the Chinese or have a certain expectation of the Chinese, even though this is not warranted at all. Some people in the West, they trust the Russians and pro-Russian circles because it's always the ideology that counts. And even though they should know better, and you shouldn't let yourself get used by China or Russia. Second flaw, morals are usually tied to the ideology. So no matter what bad deed is done, if it's painted in a certain ideological way, these deeds are being excused or rationalized or even endorsed. Of course, this is a big problem. And the third big flaw of ideological thinking is the perception of reality. So if you tie a perception of reality to an ideology, you're running into major, major problems. So if your favorite circles claim something, people tend to accept all kinds of phony evidence and anything that could be interpreted as affirming that claim. That is then weighted, measured in gold. Like, this is perfect evidence, people think. And any facts that contradict what people want, any other facts are being dismissed, ignored, or labeled disinformation. So, the larger powers in history and the superpowers, they would have never been successful if they had used ideological thinking over intelligence thinking. Now, what classifies intelligence thinking? What are the biggest, most important attributes of intelligence thinking? Well, number one, sympathy and trust are built slowly, sometimes even over multiple generations. And that sympathy and that trust has to be earned. And it's being checked and rechecked and rechecked. Professionals are not content if somebody tells them what they want to hear. Next, the perception of reality is really, really sharp in intelligence circles. You really want to know exactly how things are. You don't want to bias based on wishful thinking, how you want things to be. Professionals are willing to check and recheck anything and to take new facts into account. Even if it's an old case, people are still willing to reopen that can of worms and get better answers. Now, for intelligence professionals, moral is what serves the mission. That's pretty clear. So they won't accept anything just because it's painted in a certain ideological way. It's just about what works and what doesn't. So you can recognize an amateur or a cheap propagandist. You can recognize those people easily because they always proclaim narratives which they prefer and which their ideological political group prefers. But reality is rarely how you want it to be. But ideological people, they can have anything that contradicts their ideology. So no matter if it's about Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, Nord Stream pipeline, Ukraine, or whatever, or climate research, you have to have clean, professional analysis done. And you can't be guided by what you want things to be. And so people and organizations that you may hate, they can give you a mix of facts and lies, and you have to be able to figure out which one is a fact and which one is a lie. And sometimes people in organizations, they don't tell a single lie. They just present selected facts which benefit their cause, and they don't mention anything that's really, really interesting. So you can't just denounce something as a lie just because you don't want to hear it. You know, what's the criterion, or what are the criteria for a lie? You know, something is not necessarily a lie just because somebody says it, somebody that you hate, and you don't like what they're saying. That doesn't mean it's a lie. So it's also not a criterion for truth that somebody says something and you like that someone and you like what they're saying. So just by liking it doesn't make it true. So you recognize an amateur, you recognize a propagandist, oftentimes because they will laser focus on one certain preferred scenario, and they ignore other scenarios, or they trash other scenarios, even though it may be plausible, relevant scenarios. And oftentimes ideologists, they prioritize a scenario that makes little sense, or sometimes even no sense, and oftentimes you can tell that this propagandist doesn't really understand how intelligence agencies work and how these empires work. So sometimes you get influencers who just take their stuff from, or their basic ideas from, classic conspiracy literature, which has been influenced a lot over 200 years by various government intelligence agencies. So I'm going to do more on that topic. So this became really a thing after the French Revolution, and British intelligence started to really put out these conspiracy best-selling books, right? So if somebody just takes his ideas from those basic narratives, they claim they can solve every case in 5 minutes, which is not the case. Professionals understand that many times it takes a long time to solve a case, and usually you just get certain likelihoods and you can finally solve the case. Amateurs, they claim to solve every case right away. So there's a lot of good and even very good literature on the empires and intelligence agencies. And you can get those books sometimes even really cheaply, and you can just learn how an intelligence agent thinks. You can't just enroll in some university and get all the goods, and get all the good stuff. So you have to read if you want to be a professional. So if there's an influencer out there and this influencer doesn't quote relevant literature often, and that person hasn't quoted literature for a long time, or it's not clear if that person has actually read that literature, if you find these warning signs, then you're not dealing with a professional. So you can learn from these successes and from the failures of many different intelligence assets, agencies, many different agencies from many different countries, many different eras. You can learn from all of this. And you're not limited in the way that these assets were limited. So for example, if you're a higher ranking field agent, or you run agents, or you're a director of operations, or you're a station chief somewhere in the world, you are limited. You can't investigate your superiors the way you may want to. You don't get the time and the budget to do so, and you don't get the training to really deal with your own government. So if you're outside of government intelligence agencies, you're not limited like that. So you can actually go beyond. So oftentimes when you are talking to someone who's very ideological, and you try to talk about the intelligence level of that topic, so what's going on in terms of intelligence networks and operations, oftentimes these people will block that part of the conversation. They do not want to get onto that plane, that level, of intelligence matters, they rather want to drag the discussion back to where they feel comfortable, namely the ideological level, the ideological sphere. Usually ideologists are more willing to talk about intelligence matters if it concerns the other ideological groups, the enemy, right? So that's when they start quoting things they may have seen in the press, or they've picked up on the web, sometimes some actual report, sometimes some piece of disinformation. They will happily attack the other side, but they're usually unwilling to analyze their own side and their own group in an appropriate fashion. So learn from the winners, not from the losers. Start thinking like an intelligence asset. That is very, very important advice. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video and share our content.